Good morning, everyone. We will get started now. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Before introducing today's speaker, I wanted to make one quick announcement, which is that our Grand Rounds next week will be from Dr. Stephen Kushner. Dr. Kushner is a new recruit to our faculty at Columbia Psychiatry, and he will be presenting on neocortical interneuron myelination, fundamental mechanisms, and clinical translation. So I hope you're all able to join that next week. And today, it's a real honor and privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Carola Suárez-Orozco. Dr. Suárez-Orozco is a distinguished professor of counseling and school psychology at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And she's also the co-founder of Reimagining Migration. Dr. Suárez-Orozco's work focuses on elucidating the child, adolescent, and young adult experience of immigration, how their development is shaped by immigration, and how they are changed by the process. She has studied a wide variety of processes, including identity formation, family separations, civic engagement, and the unauthorized experience. A focus on school settings has been an enduring theme in her research, as schools are a first point of contact between immigrant children, their families, and the new society. Additionally, education is a critical predictor of current as well as future well-being and socioeconomic mobility. Dr. Suárez-Orozco has published several books, including Children of Immigration, Learning a New Land, Transitions, the Development of the Children of Immigrants, and Immigrant Origin Students in Community College, Navigating Risk and Reward in Higher Education. Dr. Suárez-Orozco has been awarded numerous awards, including the American Psychological Association Presidential Citation, and she has served as chair of the APA Presidential Task Force on Immigration and is a member of the National Academy of Education. So it's a real honor and privilege, and very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Posner. Delighted to see you all, albeit in this manner. And so today I would like to address, as you could imagine, immigrant origin children. This has been an enduring interest and passion in my professional and research life. And I've been thinking about that topic for about 30 years now, and long before most psychologists or folks in the mental health field were really addressing that particular topic. Sociologists, demographers, and economists have been addressing immigration and how it's shaping our society for decades, but often children are lost in that conversation. And as someone in your position many years ago, studying clinical psychology, I entered the field speaking Spanish and therefore being assigned Spanish-speaking patients, Spanish-speaking families, Spanish-speaking children. And I found myself at a loss to really address the needs because there was so little training on how to really do this work in culturally sustaining and informed ways. So that set me on my quest to try to best understand how migration shapes young people and families. So today, what I'd like to share with you are some key thoughts about what are the key issues that folks, the children, particular children and adolescents and their families face, and what we in the field who provide services or do research or even go on to shape policy should be thinking about. So let's start with why this even matters. Okay, so let's see if I can get my slides to work. So we live.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your slides are not shared quite yet. I don't know if you intend to.
Well, I'm so glad, all right, apologies for that. So technical difficulty, folks, sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, I shared it earlier and I guess I somehow unshared it. Apologies.
No problem.
All right.
There should be a button on the bottom for.
Yeah, no, I'm looking for it, but somehow I lost that ability. Okay, I need to go open you up, share my screen. I do this every day, several times a day, so I should know how to do this. Can you see now?
Yeah, we can see all of your slides.
And now I want to do it in slideshow. Got it.
Perfect.
All righty. Thank you for your patience, everyone. All right, so we are currently all living in the United States, which has as its foundational narrative the notion that we are a nation of immigrants. Nearly everyone in the United States shares a family migration story, whether they know it by or not, and whether it was an immigration story that came out of a choice or through forced migration. But almost everyone, unless you come from indigenous roots, have migration in somewhere in your background. And so this is a space where we should all be thinking about our shared experiences. And yet, while immigration is often idealized looking backwards, thinking back on the family experience, it's often demonized in the present. A recent book by historian Erica Lee points to the ways in which practices like the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese internment camps, Operation Wetback, the Muslim Bang, among others, are all ways in which, while the US cultivated a myth of a nation of immigrants, it often it also kind of competed with a virulent xenophobic kind of exclusion at the same time. And so here we see images from the past, and today we're facing narratives like the ones until recently under the Trump administration, and that legacy is still something we're battling with. So let me frame it also this issue in terms of the prevalence rates. Immigrant origin children currently constitute, 26%, almost 27% of our children. And yet in 1970, they only made up about 6% of our children. So this has been a really rapidly growing number. They make up over 18 million of our children and adolescents. And they also make up roughly a third of our young adult population, the 18 to 30-year-old population. So this is a rapidly growing group of folk. And we simply need to understand what their experiences are like in order to best serve them. And let me point out that the vast majority, 87%, almost 88%, are citizen children. As such, they constitute our future. They're part of who we are right now, and they, as a nation, and who we will become, and how they fare will have incredible implications for us as a society. Of course, I'm a psychologist, so I care most about how they will fare as people and how they will be able to cope and flourish as human beings. But if for no other reason, we should be thinking about it as in terms of how they will fare as part of our society, because our society will only do well if they do well. So let's review some basic definitions before we move on. So in the education world, which is where a space I have spent a lot of time, immigrant origin young people are often referred to or reduced to being English learners or English language learners. They're also referred to as dual language learners, English as second language learners, or emerging bilinguals. And I would suggest that this is a really crass category because it really doesn't attend to the whole child. picture of their experience, and it reduces their experience to simply language learning, while an important issue, certainly not their entire experience. I think of immigrant origin children as the first and second generation, meaning that they were either born abroad or their parents were born abroad, and I'll talk about this a bit more. So when I'm talking about immigrant origin children, that's who I'm talking about. And then another group that often gets conflated into this are folks who are undocumented. And while some in the first generation are undocumented, or roughly a quarter, they certainly don't constitute the majority. But a very large number of immigrant origin children, both in the first and second generation, fall within a mixed family status, meaning that they are citizen children, but they live in families where a member of their family, either their parents or their siblings or some combination of the two, are not documented. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that matters, and about the whole notion of liminality, meaning that one can be undocumented at one point or have some sort of status, recognized status at one point, and then slip into another status. So these are not fixed kind of spaces. So this is what I mean when I talk about immigrant origin children and youth. I mean young people who are of the first and second generation. So why does generation matter? The first generation typically are struggling with second language acquisition, not always, because some immigrants come from primarily English-speaking countries, but for many, it involves learning English in the context of the United States. And let me, as a parenthetical, tell you that many of these dynamics apply to other spaces besides the United States, but today I'm focusing on a US-centric conversation. They often bring with them immigrant optimism, the sense of that tomorrow might bring a better future, so often a frustrated optimism, but nonetheless, optimism, as we know, has inoculating features, which help folks move forward. They also often have a dual frame of reference so that they can compare their lot in the here and now, in the space they're in, to the one they were in before. And while in many ways they're not in a very good space, they can compare it to a worse space that they might have been in. Not always the case, but sometimes. They also have higher rates of an unauthorized status than the second generation. And they have a very high likelihood of being ostracized by peers for their newcomer status. The second generation share with the first generation parents, meaning parents who were born abroad. Second generation is born here, but they also have first generation parents who may not always know, recognize the social codes or the cultural codes of the new land. They have the automatic advantage of being authorized. They tend to struggle less with learning the second language challenges, although if they have attended less than optimal schools, they still will have challenges in the reading and writing domain because they won't have been exposed to terrific education. And they often are losing the first language, especially if it's not used on a regular basis or if they're not exposed to writing forms. They also have difficulty maintaining that sense of immigrant optimism that the first generation has. Let me talk a little bit about the first generation and various statuses that you may have heard about, and I just want to clarify them a little bit. You'll see on I'm starting with the first generation. There are folks that what Cecilia Menjival calls in the liminal status, meaning they are in, they're vetted or not by immigration services, and they've been designated with some sort of status that is temporary and can be taken away at any given time. It doesn't last forever. So you have unaccompanied minors in this situation. You have DACA, which is, I never remember the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. You have folks in TPS, Temporary Protection Status, which is a designation given to folks from various countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, among others, who are leading situations where the whole country has been decimated for various reasons, and people are given temporary status, which often lasts for many years, and then asylum seekers. And these are statuses that that people can't count on and can be moved around. And there are other, by the way, statuses of this kind. And then there are folks who have been vetted, and all TPS and DACA, for example, asylum seekers, they've all been there. Well, TPS and DACA in particular have already been vetted to get to that point. When folks get to regularized status, they have now been fully recognized by the immigration services and are have statuses that they can count on. And then there's a second generation, much larger, which have birthright citizenship. And these circles that you see are not, if I had more talent, I would have done them according to the actual size of these designations, but they're just to sort of give you a sense of how they are interlocked and have kind of relationships to one another. And then there are, I'll refer back to the mixed status families. These are citizen children living with family members who do not have the advantage of and privilege of documentation. They typically have one or more parents who are not documented. Their siblings may not be documented, or very loved extended family members like grandparents or aunts and uncles may not be documented. And these kids live in fear of deportation and separations from their loved ones at any given time. Many of the kids in temporary protection status or with DACA also live in this kind of situation. They also tend to have less access to services. While they're legally entitled, their parents, because of their own less than optimal documentation status, are fearful of accessing services and may not get the services for their kids because it exposes the family. Just in terms of the 5 big top countries of immigration, and people come from all over. Excuse me, I'll turn this off. People come from all over the world, of course. Mexico shares the largest contiguous border with us, and has a long history of people coming back and forth across the border. They are the largest sending group, although they've declined over recent years. China is the next largest group, India and the Philippines, and El Salvador is the 5th largest. And what we see with about 80 to 85% of the new immigrants, the immigrants that have come in the recent wave, unlike the immigrants who came during the European wave, is that they are highly diverse, racially and ethnically. So most come from China, from Asia, from Central America, from South America, Africa, the Caribbean, and as such, most of them are of racial and certainly of ethnic, but also of racial backgrounds that are distinct to the European backgrounds that fueled earlier waves of migration in the United States, and that sets them up to be what has been termed perpetual foreigners, meaning no matter how long they're here, they're always designated to be other in some ways, as we are seeing in these horrendous events around Asian immigrants in recent months. And they also face cultural, they're also culturally diverse. We see over 400 different languages being represented in the United States right now. Spanish is, of course, the most frequent, given that, given the Mexican, South American, and Central American backgrounds, but there are 460 languages currently represented in the United States, and in many of the schools, like in New York, Boston, LA, we see hundreds of schools, hundreds of languages that schools are trying to serve in one way or another. We also see a huge growth in religious diversities. So Catholicism has, the Catholic Church has blossomed in recent years, as have many of the evangelical churches with recent migration, and then non-Judaic Christian denominations as well have grown, as in the case of Muslim migration. And we also see huge diversity in terms of family capital. So we have amongst, and I think in the average public imaginary, most folks think of immigrants as not being very educated, but in fact, it's very bimodal. We have amongst the least educated arriving as immigrants, but we also have amongst the most educated. So a quarter of doctors come from our immigrants, a quarter of, or over a quarter of CEOs of technology companies are of immigrant origin. So we're seeing huge educational peaks, but also some valleys. And then we see huge diversity in terms of recognized documentation as well. And these kinds of family capitals have huge implications for how kids will be doing. So what I'd like to do, so I gave you kind of a rapid tour of the expanse of who immigrant origin children are and immigrant origin families are. And now what I'd like to do is give you some theoretical frames that I think matter and will help us understand how to assess and serve this population in ways that I hope will be useful. So I'll be talking about several stress theories that are relevant, risk and resilience theory, as well as ecological theory as frameworks for framing how we think about immigrant origin young people. So let's begin with stress. And we know there are lots of different ways. I'm not even going to begin to try to give you all a lecture on stress, but I'll just give you a quick overview and ways of thinking about that. We know that one way of thinking about stress was around major life events and transitions, jobs, moves, ruptures in relationships. All were known, if there were a lot of them happening in short periods of time. It's been documented that they have a cumulative effect on health and psychological functioning. Now, if we think about immigrants, they're going through a whole lot of major life transition, all in a very rapid and short period of time. A competing model of stress is around daily hassles. The notion that it's not this competing theory is it's not that those big transitions that matter so much as those kind of daily hassles of life. And if you have too many of them happening at the same time, that's what wears you down. So, transportation problems, housing problems, financial worries, problems with employees, stresses around the weather, changes going from the Caribbean to cold New York, that kind of thing. If you put them all together, those are the kinds of hassles that really bother folk and have effects. And again, immigrants go through a lot of that. You can add language hassles amongst that to that list. And then a more current modeling is around adverse childhood experiences, which I'll go into in a second. And then the last model to think about is a culture of stress. So let's think about adverse childhood stress. These are the 10 usually talked about in assessment. ACEs, forms of physical abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. We know that being exposed to more than one of these has implications for long-term health outcomes, as well as short-term learning, for example. And I would suggest that some of these are certainly relevant to immigrant young people, but it's not a comprehensive list at all. And it leaves out, for example, some immigrant-specific traumas, like exposures to pre-migratory traumas, which many have undergone, the dangerous voyages that many have undergone, family separations prior to migration, during the voyage, as well as chronic concerns around deportation and the actual deportation of loved ones that so many families have faced. So while this model is useful, it hasn't really taken into account the full migratory or immigrant child experience. And yet I think it's a useful frame to keep in mind as we think about the stresses that immigrant young people and families encounter. So now moving to the BROFENBRENNER ecological theory, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with or have been exposed to. And this is a notion that if you place the child at the center, the proximal kinds of, there are various levels of the system that they interact with that matter. So at the most proximal level, the family, the neighborhood, the school matter a great deal in terms of how the child is going to function. At a more distal level, levels at the ecosystem, like parent work conditions, or will have implications for how kids do. And very importantly, and I'll turn more to this in a moment, what's going on at the macro system at the most distal level will have huge implications for how young people will do. So before I get to kind of some specifics of the different levels, let's talk about ways to consider immigrant child adjustment. So we can think in terms of milestone development. Are kids meeting their, are they doing well on the social relationship level? Are they making academic progress? Are they participating in civic activities appropriate for their age level? Are they participating in the labor market? And one of the issues for immigrant children, I think, is that so much of the narrative, especially around it in education, is they're not doing well because they're not doing well on academic tests. And these academic tests are very much designed with a middle-class white frame in mind, with monolingual English speakers in mind. And so we often fail to understand ways in which they are doing well. And we're looking towards exactly what they don't do well on, and we don't kind of look at the longer term view of how they're doing. Another way of looking at how they're adjusting is how they're doing psychologically. And of course, in a clinical practice, we only see folks who are not doing so well. And I would suggest that many are doing better than you would expect, given the stresses that they're undergoing. Although at a high price, with probably less than optimal cortisol levels flowing through their system. And then there are another way to assess how they're doing is how are they meeting acculturative and enculturative tasks. So are they acquiring host culture competencies? Are they acquiring the host country language? Are they learning and maintaining their home language? And I would argue that this is extremely important in terms of family relationships and sense of identity and sense of pride about one's own group. Are they forming constructive social, ethnic, and national identities? Are they developing a sense of social belonging within the new society? Is the new society allowing that to happen? That's another question. Are they able to bridge cultures? Because ultimately that is the sign of doing well. So when we think about how the child is doing at the individual level, we need to be thinking of various developmental competencies, the biological resources, cognitive resources, social emotional resources, as well as temperament and personality. Very important is to be thinking about social positions or positionality. And that sounds very trite in some ways, but it's under thought through. And so the intersection of legal status, generation, socioeconomic status, gender, race and ethnicity, and even religion, something we tend to underthink about in the social sciences, because many of us are quite secular, but with immigrant families, religion tends to play a really important role and can play a very important social buffering role as a social buffering and providing social capital. And then, of course, how are folks coping, how are young ones coping with traumatic events, extensive xenophobia and racism, which has been really, pun intended, trumped up over the last 4, 5, 6 years, as well as concerns around deportation. At the microsystemic level, we should be considering, as we do assessments, to figure out functioning and where we can be helping to bolster functioning. We should be thinking about neighborhoods that kids are in. What are the economic opportunities in those spaces? How segregated are the spaces that they're in? Is policing and crime an issue? And not all segregated neighborhoods are toxic. Some of them are quite cohesive and offer lots of social support. So where are the points of strength in those neighborhoods that we can be connecting children and families to? And then at the school level, schools are not at all the same. There are some schools that are tremendously toxic, are hostile to immigrant origin kids or children of color in general, who don't provide quality curriculum and pedagogy, and are really cold, hostile spaces. And yet there are others that provide opportunities for flourishing for kids who take a culturally responsive, sustaining, nurturing framing, who really get to know and understand the families that they're working with, who strive to create school climates that are safe and nurturing and provide supportive relationships, and also who have high expectations for their students that don't fall to the pobrecito, poor little ones syndrome of, oh, well, they can't, poor little ones, they're not going to be able to learn. They know these children can learn with the right scaffolding. And then what about families? Is this a cohesive and supportive family, or is it one that is struggling? Are they struggling with issues of family separations and complicated reunifications? And are there intergenerational conflicts around values, beliefs, and goals? Are they aligned or are they misaligned? And then, of course, and this is often something that is not in our sphere of thinking as psychologists or psychiatrists, are issues around the political and social, macro, systemic, distal level of development. We cannot ignore the political and social context. This is always important, but immigrant origin families over the last half decade have been facing particularly turbulent times. There have been punitive and relentless anti-immigration policies in place. There's been a symbolic and let me just give you a kind of a sense of an array of the ways in which this is played out. So there's been a symbolic removing, and this is symbolic, but its symbols are important, a removing of a nation of immigrants from the US Citizen and Immigration Services website. So we were for centuries, we were a nation of immigrants, and that was removed from that website. And there's been the build the wall rhetoric. There have been draconian deportations, and frankly, that didn't start under Trump. That actually has been going on since the Obama administration. There have been massive separations of children from families as an express deterrent policy. There have been attempts to end DACA as well as temporary protection status, involving, nearly 1 million people between the two groups, as well as involving huge potential family separations, as many of these young people have had children who are now citizens. There's been a dramatic reduction of asylees. We have more asylees nationally today than ever before. There are 26 million asylees in the world, and yet the United States is taking in only 18,000. We have 18,000 in a world of 26 million. There have been changes in public charge access. And the Migration Policy Institute has chronicled 400 systematic policy changes during the Trump administration, Trump and Miller administration, to reduce access. We also had a huge negative media representations of folks of immigrant origin, a dramatic rise in hate crimes. And this is very much at the intersection of xenophobia with race. And the target moves around according to where media and public folk just, point their finger. So, when Muslims were considered to be the main problem, there was a dramatic jump in hate crimes against Muslims and anyone who looked Muslim. So Sikh Indians who are not Muslim but were mistaken to be became the target of hate crimes. When the build a wall rhetoric was at its peak, anti-Latinx hate crimes were way up. And since the pandemic began and China was blamed for that, anti-Asian hate crimes have gone way up, as we've seen in recent weeks. But that's been going on for about a year now. It's just kind of hit the public imaginary with that shooting that happened in Atlanta. So that outer context absolutely has implications for the family, the schools, the neighborhoods, and then in turn has implications for how the child is doing. And we can't uncouple these. So I've spent in many ways too much time on the many risks that these children and families face. I would like to spend a little time also talking about the extraordinary resiliencies that they demonstrate. So immigrant families are the sources of resilience for one another. They tend to have very tight family systems that just hold everyone together, and all the sacrifices of migration are often framed around a better life for the family that is taken across generations. Now, there are, by individualistic American standards, it may seem a little enmeshed, or a little kind of against the individualistic model of how things are done, but it also has tremendous, people help one another, and they are inspired by one another and feel a tremendous sense of social responsibility. I mentioned earlier immigrant optimism. This is has an inoculating. It helps to an inoculating function. It helps to get folks through the difficult times, because tomorrow will be a better day. It is sometimes an illusion. Sometimes a better day doesn't come around, but it does serve a function that has some value to be considered. Many immigrants value education, and in fact will frame the story of migration. And parents will frame the story of migration around the opportunity to give their children a chance at a better education than they might have had in their country of origin. They don't always know how to play the game of education in the way that upper middle class parents know how, but they in abstract often value education and will continuously remind their children of how important this may be. Not every family, but most. They often have an extraordinary work ethic that is hard to mimic across non-immigrant populations. As I mentioned, family cohesion is very much a source of resilience. They have, and then there's a kind of understood strength of bilingual, strength that comes from being bilingual. There's emerging evidence that bilinguals tend to be more flexible in terms of their cognitive approaches. Because merely by being bilingual, there's always more than one way to approach any given item or word. There are also social emotional advantages in terms of the ability to take perspective and a tremendous sense of social responsibility that begins at the family, but often goes out to the community and to trying to help other people. Very high levels of sense of social responsibility in the immigrant community, in the first and second generation young people. So let me address the last form of stress that I mentioned, acculturative stress. Here are some of the ways in which families are stressed. Adults are often stripped of their familiar roles. The ways in which they approach things are not, older adults who in their own society might have been highly respected and, knew how to do things, were people who were turned to for wisdom and advice, all of a sudden arrive here and they're discombobulated. They don't really know how to play by the rules of the new society. And this is not an elder-centric society. So we often see family demotions amongst elders. Children have a very strong senses of responsibility, often imposed by migration. Children in psychobabble are parentified. They're given responsibilities often well beyond their developmental norms. As they take on sibling care and as their parents are often working long hours, and as they take on translation roles, because children learn the new language more quickly than older folk. And so the downside is this parentification, this burdening beyond the years. But the upside is that if it doesn't overwhelm them, they do develop the sense of responsibility, which makes for good human beings in many ways. Folks who are really trying to do the right thing for others. Less of this kind of individualistic, what's good for me, and more good, what's good for others orientation, which I would argue is not a bad thing. And then another issue that around acculturative stress is disciplining mechanisms that are well recognized and approved of in one cultural context are no longer appropriate or viewed as appropriate in the new cultural context. So what we find, for example, spanking is a fairly universal across many, many cultures, way of bringing children into line. But as they arrive in the US, there are lots of rumors that 911, the kids can call 911 and that there will be, that they might lose, the custody might be lost. And so, they haven't, many immigrant families haven't learned, timeouts and some of the classic middle class sanctioning mechanisms. And so yet we know that parents need to have ways in which they bring their children in line. And so as they lose their old models and don't have new ones yet in place, sometimes some parents lose control over their children, which can be an issue. Migration will often intensify old countries' ways as people hold on to what they know, and desperately maintain control. And this is when in some families we see issues and the classic calling of 911. So with familial acculturative gaps, we see elders oriented to the heritage culture. We see children oriented more to the host culture, and trying to kind of find their way between those two. Immigrant elders may have difficulty, and not all do, but many have difficulties understanding and communicating with schools. Obviously, the more educated they are, the more, and if they speak English, the less they have these difficulties. But they still may have a sense that it's impolite to get involved in schools, because that's not the way they did it in their own countries. And so determining an appropriate level of autonomy and supervision in the new cultural context can be a challenge. And then there's the very real problem that I've seen clinically many times is, we all know that, for example, in adolescence, miscommunication is something that happens in many families. But when you add to that different levels of communicative ability in both languages, you really have a problem. So what I've seen in clinical situations is that you have parents who continue to speak in native language. The child begins to speak in English. The parent understands some English. The kids understand some of their native language. And so they're speaking in two different languages. They think they understand each other, but actually they don't always. And this kind of brings miscommunication up to a level on steroids, and creates all sorts of problems. And so in these situations, children may turn less to their elders when they have problems and more to peers. And yet, as I've said, there's a deeply intertwined sense of family responsibility in many families that can be a double-edged sword. Another issue that I want to point to is the issue that I'm sure you've heard a lot of in the news, but there are two ways in which this is, I want to talk about it: the normative family separation and what I'll call enforced separations. So with normative family separations, I'll share a little data from a study I did. It was 400 immigrant students or immigrant young people, newcomers, coming from 5 different sending places: Haiti, Mexico, Central America, China, and the Dominican Republic. These were 400 kids, which we followed for 5 years. And we asked the parents and the kids to talk about a little bit, tell us a little bit about how you arrived, who came first, who came next. And these were all kids that were not recruited from clinical situations, but were recruited from public schools. So they were normal kids, not clinical popular kids, and families. And what we learned in that study was more than 75% had been separated from either the mother or the father or both from anywhere from 6 months to 10 years. So family separations was actually normative. It was more likely that they were separated sometime during the migration voyage than not separated. And any of you who have children or have babies, the idea of being away from them from 6 months or 2 years or 5 years, think about what that's like and think about attachment theory and what that might mean for well-being. So the point I'm making is family separations comes with a migratory process. You know, and I could give a whole talk on that study alone. There were huge differences between countries. Haitian and Central Americans were more likely to have much longer separations. But the point is, separations happen. And when the kids were reunified with the parents, the journeys were not often smooth. It was often a rocky transition before folks kind of got back into gear and kind of understood one another. And sometimes the transitions took a long time to manage. And of course, we all hear about enforced separations, what has been going on at the border. And again, that could be a whole talk, but there are currently 16,000 kids who have crossed the border unaccompanied. And this was an express policy put in place by the last administration to discourage migration. And now there is a surge as you know, as the situation has gotten worse in Central America, and with some renewed optimism that things might not be quite as draconian under the new administration. And so now we're facing a situation where, again, we have huge numbers of kids who are living in these kind of very precarious situations that we struggle to figure out a way to accommodate and reunify families. And then, of course, there are another form of enforced separation are kids who are citizen children whose parents are being deported, and that continues. So separations are a huge issue in immigrant families, one that we have a long way to figuring out humanitarian strategies. I'm coming to an end in my talk because I want to respect time. I'd like to talk briefly about educational challenges that immigrant kids face. As I mentioned earlier, they are much more than English language learners, though that's what schools, all big school districts, all they think about is ELLs, English language learners. And they do very little to think about taking on really optimally educating these children with a whole child approach. They often don't recognize the bilingual advantages that the children bring to the table. And we find that teachers are really ill-prepared to meet this population's needs. Most schools of education simply do not teach about immigration or do not teach about the immigrant experience. This is simply not part of teacher education. And so teachers come in simply not knowing much about how to best meet the needs of these children. And, you know, as a result, we see that immigrant origin kids, particularly designated as English language learners, are both over and underrepresented in special education. So kids who are simply going through the normative process of learning another language, which takes 5 to 7 years of optimal instruction to get to the point of which they really have full capacity to read and write at the levels of their English-speaking native-born peers. So kids who are kind of still not, you know, at the same level as their native-born peers will be sent to special education or sent to be evaluated for special education, and many psychologists don't have the tools to really do these assessments very well, so they'll be overrepresented. And then there are other kids who are clearly facing some issues around language learning, around neurological issues, dyslexia, language learning disorders of some kind, and these issues are overlooked because it's attributed to simply being a language learning issue. So there's both this over and under representation issue. And then, of course, we have the issue that I mentioned earlier around racialization. And we know that this society has very low expectations of kids of color, especially Black and brown kids. And so immigrant origin children from these backgrounds typically fall into these kind of lowish standards, low expectations, and Asian kids are often ignored and kind of invisible in the whole system. So in respect of time and in summary, I would like to recommend that as you approach immigrant origin children and their families, you take a systems perspective. You recognize that the extended family is an extremely important unit of analysis. We tend, as clinicians, to think about mothers and fathers, but in immigrant families, the grandmother, the grandfather, the aunts, the uncles, madrinas, padrinos, are all extremely important and should be taken into consideration as part of the family systems assessment. And we should be recognizing how resilient so many of these families are in spite of the odds and the undertow that they face. We should be considering ways in which to bring in the community, the religious institutions, after-school organizations, ethnic organizations, that faith-based organizations I mentioned, that are trusted within the community and can provide important social capital. And we need to be linking in a societal context where exclusion and xenophobia are unfortunately at the fore. We should be finding ways to think about fanning social belonging and inclusion and looking for ways to enhance our settings so that they do a better job of providing messages of inclusion and belonging. So thank you very much for your time. I'm leaving some references for you should you need them. And I'd like to open it up for Q&A, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suárez-Orozco. That was really a wonderful, wonderful talk. And
thank
really,
you. Shall I stop my share?
Either way is fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, well, let me stop my share so I can actually, okay, let me escape.
Great, great.
Okay.
You know, the experience of coming to the United States is so foundational for so many people and so many of our patients. And so to be educated about all the different components of it from your expertise is tremendously helpful.
I'm so glad.
So I wanted to start with one question. You mentioned, or you sort of recommended in a school setting a whole child approach. And since most of us are not that well versed in different educational approaches, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about that and what that would look like for children. Well,
a whole child approach is kind of what I laid out today. It's thinking, schools typically think about educational needs. Like, we've got to teach them math. We've got to teach them how to read. We have to teach them, you know, the 3 R's. And they don't, and with this population, it's always been, for the last 30 years, bilingual education, English second language education. How are we going to teach them English? You know, it's all about the language acquisition process. And a whole child approach takes the notion that the child you have to address the psychological, the social emotional piece of learning, along with, a child can't learn if they're anxious, if they're preoccupied with their mother being taken away at any given moment, if they're hungry. You have to sort of think about the whole child's well-being. And then, community psychology will tell us that we need to be thinking about kind of the neighborhood, the school context. So the way I laid out the model is a whole child approach. It's really taking a comprehensive view of the child, thinking about the social emotional learning, as well as, I think about, when I think about kids in I think we shouldn't be just doing work that is focused at immigrant kids, although I think that's part of what we have to start with is understanding who they are and what their needs are. But then in a school setting, we shouldn't be doing what we do in special ed, which is pull out, like picking the kid out and saying, okay, designating them as an other, yet another way. We really should be doing comprehensive approaches that is inclusive in and build relationships across all students. So that would be taking the whole child. So you'd really, if I was mistress of the universe and I had a magic wand, it would be an SCL approach with, especially in schools with high densities of immigrant kids, where there would be lots of books about the immigration experience, where it's normalizing that experience for everybody, not just the immigrant kids, but the non-immigrant peers. So there's a kind of a growing appreciation for one another.
Great, thank you. There's also a question about the study that you referenced of children in family separation, and wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how these children process those experiences. You can imagine children being angry at their home of origin, angry at the country that they're entering, angry at their parents. What was your what kind of stories did you hear from these children?
You're absolutely right. Anger was one of the emotions, but it was complex. We interviewed both the parents and the kids about that process. And so I would say that there's a lot of ambivalence. So from the parents, let me just take it from the parents' point of view. The child has been present in the parents' point of view, especially the mother, by the way, I've got to say, but especially the mother, but often in fathers as well. The parent has been sacrificing, saving up, dreaming for the day of reunification from the time they left the child behind, right? So for them, the child is an ever-present reality for which they're saving up for the moment where they're going to be back together. The child remains in country of origin, and they're going, if they're in a good situation, if they're in a situation where they're left with loving aunts or uncles, loving grandparents, and it's not they're not under a situation of war, but they're living in a kind of rural setting where, they have a decent quality of life, the kids are growing up and they miss their parents. First, they miss their parents, and then they kind of detach, and they get attached to their new caretakers, right? And so they really, and they move on with their lives. So they often go through stages of anger, abandonment, and then they kind of, if things are good, they reattach to these other caretakers. And so when the reunification happens for kids in these kinds of situations, they'll reunify with a parent. The parent is like so excited to see them, and it's so wonderful. And finally, all the sacrifices were worth it. But for the immigrant kid, they've just had a second attachment rupture. They're missing their grandparents. They're missing their aunts and uncles. They're missing their family. They're missing their routines. They're not seeing all the benefits of, they're meeting a stranger, and they literally talk about meeting a stranger, their parent. And they're not seeing all the benefits of migration. They're having to learn another language. It's like, ugh, like why? This is not a great thing from their point of view. At the same time, many of the kids, the more mature ones, were able to sort of appreciate that the parent was sacrificed on their behalf. And another issue that happened often in these families is that the mother would have the parents would have a new child. There'd be a new sibling along the way, sometimes with the same parent unit, sometimes with a new, couple. And so then there was often jealousy of the sibling who got to get all the parent attention when there wasn't. So that's one scenario. The other scenario, and anger was absolutely something that some kids, not all kids, voiced. Then there's a scenario where the kid was left in a less than optimal situation. So I can, one case study I can give you is a Central American young woman who, I'm gonna have to think back, it's been a few years since I did this, but basically the details were, the father was killed when she was about 4. The mother left her behind with a grandmother. The grandmother dies, 5 years later. And then so then she's left, the child is left with a neighbor, and the neighbor is abusive. And it's 9 years before the child is reunited with the parent. And so she's had, this really messy multiple loss situation and abuse along the way. So the reunification, she's really happy to see her mother, but she's meeting a complete stranger. She doesn't see her since she's 4. And she's entering, a really bad school district in a really dangerous neighborhood in California. And her transition is complicated, to say the least. So, the separations are hard, the reunifications are hard.
Oh, sorry about that. I was stuck on mute.
No, I mean, this is not reading the comments and following everything. It's not easy. So please.
Thank you.
I hope you could hear me. At one point, I live on a main street, and there was a demonstration going on in front of the.
No, we didn't.
I hope you all could hear.
We could hear you very well, and
Okay,
no
good.
background noise. Thank you. So there's a bunch of questions. People are quite interested. So let me go through some of them.
I'm glad I didn't bore you to tears. I can't watch any of your faces when I do this. So I have no idea if I'm speaking to a blank screen or like frowns or what. So it's good to know.
No, it's unnerving to speak into the ether, but there's a lot
I have to say, it is, not optimal, but what are you going to do?
So a listener writes in, many immigrant families come from countries with strong anti-homosexual and anti-transgender ideologies. Any suggestions how to help LGBTQ adolescents from such immigrant families?
That's a hard one, and you're absolutely right. It is. So I try to paint the rosiest picture of immigrant families, but every culture has their thing. And unfortunately, for many in the Caribbean country, many of the Caribbean countries, many of the African countries, and to a lesser degree, South American countries, although, Argentina, for example, was on the forefront of LGBT marriages it's and transgender rights. So it depends on the country. But these attitudes are very cultured. So you're right, it's an issue. And I don't think there's a magic bullet on this one. There's this exaggerates the culturative stresses in many ways. And so our work has to be with it. And we know with, for example, in the fundamentalist community in the US, our attempts to work across families with these very entrenched beliefs is not always successful, right? I don't think and I don't know enough about this, is not my area of specialization. I don't know that there are magic bullet approaches that have worked across all groups. Some families come around because they basically first love their child. But others have such fundamental homophobia that they can't let go. And it's so I think it's very similar to the very rigid fundamentalist ideologies in the US. And so I would say that I would look to some of the strategies that have been used there and then think about cultural adaptations. But it's about supporting the young person and helping them figure out the balance between being true to themselves and whether they can maintain some semblance of family relationship. Can they tolerate having a rupture altogether? Is that the best thing for them? And in some cases it is. Or do they find a way to kind of move back and forth? So that's not a brilliant answer, I'm afraid. But it's that, I don't think this is one and done work yet.
Yeah, it's a very, very, very challenging problem.
Mm-hmm.
Another question comes from Michael Grunbaum, who asks, are there any attachment-focused therapies that you think are promising?
Not that I've seen. I'm sorry, I wish I could say yes, but I haven't seen them yet.
Another audience member writes in, as a child of genocide survivors from Kosovo, I greatly appreciate the work that's been done to identify immigrant origin children as a distinct population. Do you find that pre-migratory traumas affect second generation immigrant origin child adjustment? That is referring to traumas that children did not themselves experience.
Yeah, great question. And I think we can look to intergenerational trauma literature for that. So it all depends on how well the first generation, the parent, is able to manage their own trauma, right? And we know that many people who have had terrible trauma don't manage it terribly well. They repress it. They have PTSD syndrome issues, and there is a pattern. We know that from the Holocaust, the immigration from coming out of the Holocaust, and as well as others, that there is a transgenerational kind of syndrome. So yes, you think about and you worry about that issue a great deal. So you can't, just because you didn't experience the trauma yourself, doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on you. A very good question.
Could you talk a bit about aspects of the immigration experience that you think are specific to the United States, or challenges that are specific to the United States versus immigrating to other countries?
That's a good question. I think a lot of the things that I talked about are I would never say nothing is universal, but acculturative challenges, learning a new language, dealing with issues of belonging. A lot of the things that I've talked about, you could go to New Zealand, you could go to Australia, you could go to the Netherlands, you could go to France, Germany, Italy, and you would see a lot of the same kinds of syndromes. I think that something that is distinct to Europe, for example, is the narrative is very much around religion. The xenophobia is pointed towards Muslims in particular. So the narrative is less around race and more around religious background. In the US, we have a legacy of racism, a very deeply ingrained legacy of racism. We're coming to that reckoning finally, since the events triggered by the George Floyd murder. And so and it's particularly entrenched around Black and white issues, but we don't manage integration around race very well. And it's less a worry around the religion and much more worry about they don't look like us, they're never going to look like us, and since they don't look like us, they're never going to become us. So I would say that is a kind of unique American. I mean, to a certain degree, they are intertwined, right? Because a lot of Muslim folk, not all, because there are lots of white Muslims, right? But a lot of Muslim folk are brown. And so they phenotypically are marked. And so in the Europe context, there is a kind of intertwining of race, being able to tell that somebody looks a little different, and the kind of the Muslim or the religious issue. But in Europe, nobody's supposed to talk about race. They don't even collect race data in the way, US has been obsessed with collecting race data forever, starting with the one drop rule. In Europe, we don't talk about this. We don't look at race, but religion is the thing. But we know that they're intertwined if you're with so that's a complicated answer to a complicated question.
Thank you. So Cristiane Duarte has a question. She writes in, could you speak about the impact of COVID-19 on immigrant children and their families, to closed borders, being away from schools? Are you concerned, for example, about an increase in school dropout among second-generation adolescents in the following month, or newcomers that never get engaged in the school systems?
Sadly, yes, that's a great question. COVID has been horrible for everybody, but particularly for marginalized folks. And immigrants, I think, have, and we don't yet have all the data, right? But I'm seeing some early reports that, well, first of all, we know that some immigrants were pushed out early of any kind of work, right? Because they just couldn't, because of the ruptures in the in the economy. So loss of work means loss of income, means precarious situations for families. Others were frontline workers of some kind, essential workers of some kind. And so a lot of them were exposed. Many of them lived in close family, multi-generational family constellations, and therefore they had very high rates of transmission around COVID. So they got hit harder than white middle-class families. And then there are schooling issues. I mean, I can go on and see if I can remember all the things I would want to say. Then, of course, in these intergenerational families, often young people felt the need to work. And so, so they were, if they were citizens in a family where there were non-citizens, they would take on essential work jobs in order to help support the family. And, at the same time, trying to juggle this very lack of engaging kind of medium that we're in right now. Now we're grown-ups and we can find advantages and disadvantages to this medium. For kids who are so intensely social, who have less than optimal foundations educationally and are still learning a new language, this is really not a great medium. It's just not. And on top of it all, they're often juggling work. And it's life and death is probably too strong a word, but it's really existential about whether everybody's going to eat and be able to pay the rent. So there's a lot of sense of responsibility about having to do that. And so we are absolutely seeing, for example, community colleges are the space that immigrant first and second generation young people are most likely to first enter when they go to college. It's cheap, it's local. And you don't have to have done terribly well, although a lot of kids who've done well still go that route. And we've seen plummeting Latinx, like 30%, plummeting rates of entering, of applications to community college. We also saw early on in COVID, in LA, for example, and I'm not sure in New York, but I've heard in other big cities that something like a quarter of the kids of immigrant origin disappeared off the school rosters. Nobody knew where they went. So for lots of reasons, there's lots to be worried about. And then, we hear a lot in education, we've got to worry about learning loss. We've got to worry about learning loss. We've got to worry about learning loss. And yeah, I agree. Learning loss is going to be, because the upper middle class kids, their parents could provide private tutors and learning pods and, everybody, they could continue to learn this way. The less advantaged were left way behind. So if middle class parents are worried about the learning loss, imagine what we should be worried about these other kids. That said, I would say we first have to attend to the social emotional needs, because nobody's learning anything until we get that taken care of. So we better be in schools in place to, attend to that, and then they'll catch up. This will be a bracket on learning for a year, sadly. And we shouldn't be obsessed with like testing everybody to show that there's a problem. We know there's going to be a problem. Let's see how we can fix it and get people back on track. So yeah, there's lots to be worried about, sadly.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just it has what the pandemic has done is we already had a tremendous problem with inequity as a society, and this has just magnified it. So we're going to have to think systemically. I think we can't just, I was trained as a clinical psychologist. It was always about this, right? The one-on-one, or, with immigrant families, that's really, I thought around family systems, because I think it's a better approach. But we actually have to think more broadly, because you can't, just fixing one person at a time, it doesn't address the much bigger problems that we're looking at.
Yeah. The crisis really does force us to change our perspectives and change how we're thinking about care. the experience of immigrating to our country is so incredibly important. And again, as I kind of alluded to before, it's something that we give thought to, but clearly not nearly enough. And so it's really such a privilege to hear your thoughts and suggestions about how we can do a better job and how we can think more carefully about this incredibly important issue.
Thank you.
So I think that's it for time today. And again, wanted to thank you and look forward to seeing everyone next week.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much for your attention. Be well.